try to spend a few brief moments on the basic introduction to the concept of cyber and electromagnetic threats in our society today. And basically, the landscape of threats today internationally are very multipolar. We are out of the Cold War. There are multiple nation states with potential interests to disrupt the communication and information technology infrastructure of the traditional developed world. Such nations, for instance in the Shanghai Eight, may have motives to ally themselves with supranational entities, with cartels. They may have totally divergent motives, but at some point during a sudden crisis, those motives may converge, and the cyber EM scenario may be attractive. Let's just cover a little bit of the nomenclature, because these terms are bandied about, and we need to understand what they mean. We've all grown up with the concept of a computer virus, and it's basically a self-executable piece of code, or it is associated with an executable file and macros. And generally, the Apple operating systems have been relatively invulnerable to this threat. Well, the virus has sort of gone out of phase, and we're now dealing with worms and Trojans. Worms are basically totally independent files that are self-functioning, that have their own internal operating system, and that can rapidly spread throughout networks and data clouds, which are emerging globally today. They are by far the greatest threat. They include logic bombs. Trojans are imposter files that we invite onto our systems, often without realizing it, that can behave like worms. And finally, the term botnet you will see appear, and it's essentially the recruitment of an innocent computer network and its units by a malicious force to execute such worms throughout the system so that there's a false flag effect. You don't know where the real threat is coming from, and an innocent set of infrastructures is utilized as the executor of the threat. Statistics, in 2010, 286 million malware threat events per month. In 2010, a major game-changing event, the Stuxnet worm, infiltrated into the Iranian nuclear program, successfully sent the centrifuge cascades enriching uranium into an explosive cascade spin rate that destroyed part of the facility. The first time in documented history that a worm, an algorithm, had been used in an act of war by an unknown force. The cyber threats that we have are of particular concern because of the evolution of the data cloud now in our technology base and our information technology infrastructure. How many of you use iPhones, iPads? You all have communicated with the cloud. Increasingly, your phones, your iPads no longer have sufficient memory to store all your data, your addresses. They go to some invisible data collection around the world. And at some point, all your personal data will be stored off your device. Those data clouds are highly vulnerable. There's already been a major event. How many of you use Skype? You will recall that Skype crashed about a year ago. It crashed because the data cloud was violated. So that demonstrated the vulnerability of data clouds. The Stuxnet worm has shown us that such data cloud entry, and actually the entry of entire networks and facilities, are now vulnerable. The Stuxnet worm, of which you will hear a great deal perhaps even today, is targeted at the controllers that operate machinery, computers, air conditioning systems, power grids, buses, trains, centrifuges, water supplies, food supply processing. They target the actual machinery that runs society, not just the computers, and that makes them even more dangerous. In 2006, President Ahmadinejad of the Islamic Republic of Iran was shown the design and the layout of the impending 3,000 centrifuge a strong facility for enriching uranium for the first Iranian nuclear weapon. And a great mistake was made by his security forces. You will see on the back of the computer screen on the right the actual schematic of the centrifuge cascade. Well, when the Stuxnet worm was analyzed, its structure was exactly parallel to that centrifuge cascade. The worm itself was introduced by an agent within the centrifuge facility using a small flash drive and was propagated to each centrifuge logic controller and was then triggered by itself. It had a pre-programmed level of code that allowed itself to be auto-triggering to bring the cascade down and set back their program by about 3 years. The next worm already on the scene appears to be a successor, the Duku, discovered by a venerable computer science institute in Budapest, Hungary. And this worm targets information systems for subversion. It enters them to gather information, transmit that information elsewhere, and to modulate or corrupt the information in the system, preparing the network, the factory, the organization, whatever the target is, for the subsequent entry of a destructive worm like Stuxnet. They clearly have emanated from the same source. Where do these worms come from? Well, clearly they require great knowledge and sophistication. Governments, industrial cartels that have the capital necessary to hire the top-tier expertise, or the very companies that manufacture and design our antiviral software. In fact, the Russian-based labs of Kaspersky, which is a major supplier of antiviral software, are one of the prime suspects for the origin of the Stuxnet worm, and not the Mossad, as many people believe. The financial markets here in New York. What could happen? You've all heard about the events of Facebook on Friday. And aside from the issue of the error in judgment that a syndicate trade was overvalued, which any reasonable banker would have known, and I refuse to let our banking institution even have anything to do with Facebook. But that's not the issue. The issue is that the trading mechanics failed. Orders were given and not executed because of the volume trades that brought the system to a halt. It was a technical glitch, which underscores the vulnerability of our trading system. Where are the problems where a worm could be inserted through hedge funds, through banks? Let me give you an example. An opponent, an adversary, could start multiple small hedge funds in Kansas, in Chicago, in Dubai, in Buenos Aires, wherever. And this could be highly organized, but they could be decentralized. They would not communicate with each other. Their strategy and their timing would be worked out ahead of time. But beyond that point, they would not communicate. At a given point in time, they would all begin to execute orders and send worms into the system through their electronic orders that were sent to the major exchanges and the brokerages. These worms would join up and cross-propagate in the clouds and the systems, and they would begin to change the dynamics, the rhythmicity, the timing in nanoseconds of the trades, thereby bringing the system to a screeching halt, because the flow of execution would overwhelm the computers or would desynchronize the entire systems on the exchanges. There could be false signals generated that would say that far greater cash was available or far less cash than was actually in the system. Orders could be given that would lead to diversion or movement of liquidity offshore or between countries in ways that was not intended, thus markedly perturbing the value of currencies. And finally, symbolic learning techniques would be used by the self-configuring worms in a way that, for instance, orders would be given for one hedge fund to trade, and then immediately the same orders would be given to trade in the opposite direction by another surrogate fund, thereby canceling out the trades and leading the market into chaos. The ultimate cyclicity and disruption of the market would cause panic, and this would be the ultimate objective, which would basically bring the market to a close. And finally, these attacks, and we have too much light here, could be generated by an attacker going through recruited networks that became parasitized, the so-called botnets. They were utilized without anyone realizing that they were recruited, and the actual orders would come from those false flag hedge funds or banks without realizing that they had been recruited by an actual attacker, and then those in turn would attack the target. What kind of countermeasures? Well, this gets very complicated, but the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency has developed a number of approaches in the defense sector, just in a nutshell, that appear to protect our force information technology structures out in the field very effectively to such reconfiguring worms. But these new technologies developed by DARPA have not even migrated into the defense community. Then I'd like to switch for a second before I close to talk about the hardware aspect. Our government, our industry, our banks have to be supplied with computers, with laptops, with cell phones. Those phones are made in countries abroad that are potential military adversaries. What if the intelligence services of such countries were to pre-position malware and worms inside the semiconductors or the circuits of the devices that we bought from them, and these were then timed to activate at some point in the future? And what if our government was vulnerable to the intrusion of such devices into our most sensitive infrastructures in the National Security Agency, the FBI? I was just very honored to be given a medallion from the FBI, which is made in China. Without singling out any country, what if our country were buying computers and we were pre-infected with malware that could go off 10 years from now? Well, fortunately, we're smarter than that. And we have dedicated electron beam scanners, which I was honored to work on when I was in the Pentagon, and X-ray diffraction systems that scan every single computer, every single cell phone that goes into sensitive institutions in the government. The banks don't do that, though. Industry doesn't do that. Only certain agencies in the government. So that's an area that people are going to have to look at in the future. And then finally, I want to talk about something entirely different. How many of you remember the Kosovo conflict? Okay. Quite surprisingly, for such insurgency conflicts, we won that conflict. But we won it because we defeated Belgrade on 2 nights. And we did that because we took a modern European city that was dependent on electricity, transportation, water, televisions, and we brought it into the 19th century. We did that with electromagnetic warfare. We dropped weaponry that didn't kill people, it didn't destroy buildings, but it saturated the city with high energy pulses, similar to lightning. And they destroyed all electrical and computer systems. Belgrade is still recovering from that. Now that was achieved by weaponry, but it can also be achieved, so it was achieved by dropping weapons from aircraft, but it can also be achieved by a handheld device that costs $70,000 to manufacture, has no restricted components, and I can buy them all at Radio Shack. It's called a flux compression generator. And it's basically, in simplest terms, a conductor wrapped around a non-conductor with an explosive in the center that drives a high charge that's generated in the center of the device into a tiny space, thereby generating an electromagnetic pulse which is similar to a burst of light. If such a device were to go off in this room and be placed here surreptitiously by a custodian at night, the television studio from which I broadcast on the 13th floor, which is one of the critical studios for the entire city, services all the major networks, Media 3, it's on the 13th floor. They would be knocked out instantaneously, and they would be unrecoverable. They could never broadcast again. All their chips, their conducting surfaces, everything would be depolarized. Now, we would not want to be in the proximity of such a device here because it would be dangerous for us, obviously. The implosion would take out this room. But the bottom line is thousands of such devices could be placed at critical locations They would not be detected. They're not radioactive. They're not biological. And if in a concerted effort they were in a crisis, in a war crisis, they were to be detonated, they would take our infrastructure out overnight and send us back into the 19th century. A great deal has been written about electromagnetic pulse, and it's been ignored by the banking community. But it's perhaps our greatest vulnerability. So there's the algorithmic software side, and there's the hardware side with off-the-shelf technology. I rarely talk about this, but this is the type of venue where this is appropriate. And that concludes my remarks. The threat is real. The threat is achievable. The entry barriers are low. They are not comparable to the complexity and difficulty of designing a nuclear weapon. They do require sophistication, but they're quite achievable and they're very difficult to trace. Thank you very much.